Hello, this is Mike Dorsey again, and we're here this week to talk about functional assessment, particularly indirect observation. So, what is the purpose of an FBA? First and primarily, it's to establish a working hypothesis about the reinforcers that are currently maintaining a challenging behavior that you've been tasked with treating. It's important to understand why that behavior is occurring and to be able to isolate the type and function of the reinforcer that's maintaining the behavior. The second is to direct you as the behavior analyst in the development of a treatment plan specifically for that particular individual and that exact behavior within that environment. There are different types of FBAs. There are what are called functional behavior assessments and what is referred to as a functional behavior analysis. Now, this is something that's extraordinarily confusing to a lot of people. And in fact, when you think about it, there really is no sort of generic term that talks about the entire field of diagnostic approaches put together, although a lot of people sort of refer to the entire thing as functional behavior assessments, but then break out functional behavior assessment as sort of a subcategory, which in some ways adds even more confusion to the entire discussion. So basically, if you just think about FBAs as sort of broken out into functional behavior assessment and functional behavior analysis. The functional behavior assessments, there are basically two types. Indirect and direct. We're going to talk about indirect today. Next week we'll talk about direct functional behavior assessments. And then after that we'll begin to talk about functional behavior analysis. Now in some ways that's sort of backwards because functional behavior analysis came first, at least in the development of that process, or some parts of it did, but we'll talk about functional behavior analysis second. Functional behavior analysis breaks out into what are called analog evaluations, which are done in what's called an analog environment, which I'll explain in a lot more detail later. Ones that are done within someone's natural environment, ones that are sort of brief functional analyses, and then the newest of all of them are what are called latency evaluations, which we'll get to in a number of weeks. The difference between assessment and analysis is fairly simple. The term functional behavior assessment basically describes some type of standardized instrument, which you're going to read about this week and next, used to provide a hypothesis in less time, less cost, less risk than a functional analysis. So it's to a large degree sort of a paper and pencil way of gathering information so that you'll be able to generate a working hypothesis. Can be done by interviewing caretakers, interviewing the individual, or by observing and conducting observations conducted within the individual's natural environment. The functional behavior analysis generally refers to a structured observation of the individual in which either the antecedents and or consequences of the target behavior are manipulated in order to provide a more predictable environment. And what I mean about that, and you'll read a lot more about this in several weeks, is that basically what you do is rather than recording what's going on in the environment as it occurs and trying to sort of understand whether the child's being allowed to escape or allowed to get attention or those sorts of things, you actually structure the environment so that every time the kid gets into that environment, you ensure that attention is delivered contingent upon the challenging behavior, or opportunities for escape are delivered, and not attention, so that it's the very same consequence every single time. That there are prompts that are put into place in a specific sequence so that you control the environment. In that way, you can sort of say, okay, in this environment, which we controlled, he responded this way, and in this environment, he responded a different way. But one of the points, and this kind of comes from a question that was posted on our forum, both of these, functional behavior assessment, functional behavior analysis, both of them generate a working hypothesis. Neither one is infallible. Neither one is guaranteed to give you the exact correct answer. I've done hundreds and hundreds of functional behavior analyses over the years. In fact, I just finished one about a week ago. And to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not completely sure that the answers we got out of that analysis are going to lead us to a successful treatment intervention. We're going to try, but we may have to modify things as we go along. So why is it important to understand maintaining reinforcers? Well, the only way to completely eliminate any behavior, whether it's a challenging behavior or any form of behavior, is through extinction. That is the removal of the reinforcers that are acting to maintain the behavior. And in the natural environment, the only way to accomplish that is to first figure out what those reinforcers are. Are they positive reinforcers? Are they negative reinforcers? Do they come from the person's environment, or do they come from within their own body? Until you're able to isolate the reinforcer that's maintaining the behavior, you can't develop an extinction procedure to eliminate access to that reinforcement. So FBAs are an extremely important, I tend to refer to them as diagnostic tool. They're a very important diagnostic tool that allows you to identify or create a hypothesis identifying what the reinforcers are maintaining the behavior, which then allows you to write a protocol, write a behavior treatment plan in which access to those reinforcers are no longer available. The next thing that you need to do, though, in order to develop a successful treatment intervention is to teach new alternatives. In addition to removing access to the current reinforcer, what we need to do is teach the individual what are called functionally equivalent replacement behaviors. Now, what do I mean by a functionally equivalent replacement behavior? I mean a behavior that the individual can engage in that is a behavior or a class of behaviors which serves the same function as the target behavior, yet doesn't cause harm to the individual, to others, doesn't result in destruction of property or any other sort of undesirable result. But for this approach to be functionally equivalent replacement behavior, it needs to require that behavior, that functionally equivalent replacement behavior, needs to require less effort to gain access to the same reinforcement. Less effort, more likely delivery of the reinforcement, easier access to the reinforcer, maybe get a greater value of the reinforcer, at least initially. But what we want to do is put the person into basically a choice paradigm. We want them on, if you remember from your introductory course, we studied something called a concurrent schedule of reinforcement. Concurrent schedule is basically I can engage in response A and get reinforcer Y, or I can engage in response B and sometimes I get reinforcer Z, or I get reinforcer Y. So if I'm over here and I engage in this behavior, I get the same reinforcer as if I engage in this behavior, but if I engage in it over here, I'm going to get it more easily. That is, the schedule of reinforcement is denser, the ease of the response is easier, so I'm going to choose to engage in that behavior at a much higher rate than I'm going to choose to engage in that one, plus the fact we've added extinction to this, so not only is it easier to get it over here with this response, if I engage in this one over here, I'm not going to get anything. So eventually I'm going to choose to engage in this class of behaviors all the time, and I will stop engaging in the challenging behaviors, at least until reinforcement is available somewhere in the future. So an example for this would be a child who hits his peers in order to escape academic demands. The first step is to isolate the reinforcement, which we have now figured out is escape. Escape from the demands. The next is to structure the environment so that the child cannot escape the demands through their aggression. We're going to use something called escape extinction, which you studied in your intro class. We're also going to put into that a graduated guidance procedure. so that if I ask the child to engage in a behavior and he begins to engage in some aggressive behavior, not only am I going to ignore the aggressive behavior, and this is one of those things, and I use this term all the time, you ignore the behavior, not the child. You ignore the aggressive behavior, and you use hand-over-hand graduated guidance with the least restrictive intervention possible. Maybe you can do it with verbal prompts, gesture prompts, but if you have to, hand-over-hand guidance to ensure that the child completes the response without gaining any type of secondary reinforcement, and in this case, without being able to escape the demand. At the same time, you want to provide the child with a non-aggressive alternative to escape. And what that non-aggressive alternative to escape would often be would be functional communication training, which is a highly successful intervention where you teach the child, rather than hitting somebody, all you have to do is raise your hand and say, "I'd like to take a break now." So you put a demand on a child, you begin the escape extinction, you begin the graduated guidance, but if they raise their hand and say, "I'd like to take a break," you let them take a break. Now, you studied all of that in your intro class, so we don't need to go through all of it right now, but that would be a perfect example of sort of a multidimensional approach to eliminating a challenging behavior where you've targeted a functionally equivalent replacement behavior, which is raising your hand and saying, "I'd like to not have to engage in this task right now." And at the same time, you're ignoring the behavior and using graduated guidance and extinction to treat the behavior. So that's a perfect example of the way you would go through the process and end up with a treatment intervention that, if your hypothesis is correct, and if it is really an escape-motivated behavior, then this treatment intervention should be highly successful in eliminating that child's behavior. So let's go on and talk a little bit about functional assessments. I know you've read a number of articles by now. The development of various FBA procedures. I talked earlier that the initial FBA procedure was developed by Brian Iwata and his colleagues in 1982. Now, when we studied the history of behavior analysis, we certainly noted that some ABC procedures were being used by others much earlier than 1982, but they weren't really thought about as a diagnostic sort of structured way of identifying, maintaining reinforcers. The Iwata study was, in fact, the first of its kind in that regard. This was followed in 1988 by Durand and Crimmins when they developed the motivational assessment scale. This is the first functional assessment instrument. So why did Durand and Crimmins feel it was necessary to develop the motivational assessment scale? Besides the fact that they could get their name on a publication and put it into a peer-reviewed journal, these two individuals are highly skilled behavior analysts and people that are very well known in the field, so they certainly weren't working for that reason. Why did they think it was necessary? Well, it was very simple. They believed that the functional analysis methodology developed by Iwata was too time-consuming and placed the client at an unwarranted level of risk. Now, you've read the article, the Iwata article, once. We're going to study it in much more depth in several weeks. But if you remember, what we did in that study was put the individuals into analog environments that lasted 15 minutes each. We rotated through 4 different types of structured environments, and we would run 20, 30, 40 replications of that set of 4. That took a long time. It could take literally days and days, if not weeks, to run all of that. When you start adding up the staff time with someone taking data, the people in the room working with the individual, the cost was very prohibitive. In fact, if you look at the study that Iwata did, published in 1982, the eventual cost of that study was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars because of the kinds of people, the fact it was being done at a med school. It was basically kind of ridiculous as far as the amount of time and effort and money that was spent. But these analog environments also, according to Durand and Crimmins and others, not only was it too time-consuming and cost too much money, but the risk that was involved by, for example, in the alone condition, leaving somebody alone for 15 minutes without supervision really did put them at a level where they were, if they got in there and they began to headbang and they did that for 15 straight minutes, that could cause a person a lot of harm. Now, if you remember in the Iwata article, we talked specifically about the fact that we had medical personnel, nurses watching these sessions every minute that they were run, and they had veto power. They could stop the session anytime they believed the person was at medical risk. They hardly ever did that, but they were there to protect the individuals. So I think that when it comes to Durand and Crimmins' criticism of the 15-minute sessions, the way that Iwata did it, it's probably a founded criticism if it's being done in a setting where they don't have access to nurses and doctors to be able to do that and to be able to monitor what goes on. But I can tell you, here it is 2010, I've been doing these since the 1980 or earlier, and every single time that I run a functional analysis, I have a medical personnel standing by in order to stop the session if they believe that the person is being harmed. Durand and Crimmins' article was titled Identifying Variables Maintaining Self-Injurious Behavior. It's interesting that Iwata did self-injury, Durand and Crimmins, and most others for a very long time only focused on self-injurious behavior and not aggressive behavior. I guess nobody really wanted to get beat up, but they wanted to be able to prove that there was a way to identify maintaining reinforcers. Durand and Crimmins, it's an indirect method. The motivational assessment scale is a questionnaire. It's developed to help establish a hypothesis of the function of the behavior problem. Informants are instructed to rate the likelihood of a target behavior occurring in different antecedent conditions. Now, I'm sure that you've looked up a copy of the form by now, but you can see here, and I know that's very hard to read, but basically there are a series of 16 questions that you ask what is called the informant. This can be a staff person, a teacher, a parent, anyone that works with the individual, and you rate on each one of these 16 questions. You rate it from 0, which is supposed to be never, to a scale of 6, which is always. And questions have to do with, does the person engage in the behavior when a demand is placed on them? Does the person engage in the behavior when they're left alone? 16 different questions that work that way. And then basically what you do is you take and you summarize the data, and you'll see that questions 1, 5, 9, and 13 all relate to self-stimulatory functions. 2, 6, 10, and 14 are escape or avoidance. They added something that was a bit of a twist from the Iwata article. Not only do they have external positive reinforcement in the form of social attention, which is what Iwata et al. Did, but they also have tangible reinforcement. That is, things like food or toys that are also external positive reinforcement. So they want to separate attention and tangible as two different forms of external positive reinforcement. Now, the motivational assessment scale, as you read, is done almost all with developmentally disabled individuals. The initial Durand and Crimmins study reported high reliability and high agreement. There were a few subsequent studies that were published in the early to mid-90s that all reported internal consistency of a moderate to high rate. Unfortunately, there are a number of other studies, specifically Zarconi, Jennifer Zarconi, who works in upstate New York, teaching at the University of Rochester Medical Center. She and Brian Iwata and I and a number of others had a study that we published where we looked at inter-observer reliability between informants and found that the inter-observer reliability on the report on each of those different 16 items. So if I know the person and you know the person and we both go in separate rooms and fill out that motivational assessment scale, and then we take our 2 copies of it, and on question number 1, I rate a 2 and you rate a 3, that's a disagreement. I have to rate a 2 and you have to rate a 2 to be in agreement. And we ran a standard inter-observer reliability, which you studied in your research methods class, and found that if you look at it in what is a very conservative way of rating reliability, we got very, very low scores with people who knew these individuals very well, teachers and well-trained staff. So we weren't so convinced that the motivational assessment scale was the best way to go. Now, from the motivational assessment scale, Brian Iwata and his colleagues decided in 1995 that they were going to try to create a better mousetrap, and they came up with something called the Functional Assessment Screening Tool. The next was something called the Functional Assessment Interview, Behavior Problems, Problem Students, Reed, Thompson, Sprague, and Horner in 1997. They looked at 10 5th, 6th, and 8th graders, 2 girls, 8 boys, and this structured interview, they coded responses on hypotheses. Overall agreement for them was about 85%. And it was a way of being able to develop another way of being able to develop a hypothesis without having to run a functional analysis. Kitch, Lewis Palmer, Hagenberg, and Sugi in 2001 did another study where they looked at 8 students. They looked at high-risk classroom and low-risk with 16 different teachers. This was another alternative to the motivational assessment scale. And some of the things that we look at when interview research conclusions or conclusions about interview respondent type of research, if you look at agreements between interviewers and other data, or between informants, you find that there are a lot of problems. You're getting a very low internal consistency. These are just not tools that something that you can use and depend on. It's also based on the retrospective memory of the person reporting the information. So I have to sit there and try to think to myself, I don't have any data to support this, but as I remember, if he's left alone, he's more likely to do it than if he's in a social environment. That's my memory. That's what I seem to remember. The word anecdotal best describes what you're doing with these different devices. In 1994, the Problem Behavior Questionnaire was an alternative to the Motivational Assessment Scale. It was done for higher incidence disabilities, not just SIB. It was based on a literature review, expert opinion of functions of behavior, and they did case studies with children to try to look again at why people engage in these behaviors. They lack data on reliability, either inter-rater over time, or internal consistency. So they really aren't able to support this Problem Behavior Questionnaire. But now we have the Motivational Assessment Scale. We have the FAST, which Brian Iwata and his colleagues in Florida did, and now we have the PBQ, the Problem Behavior Questionnaire. So we basically have 3 instruments that if you line them up next to each other, they essentially look the same. The way you run them, the methodology, the way you respond to them, all of them are essentially the same device. One has a few more questions than the other. One, the answers are, never to always. The others are a little bit different, but they're basically the same exact tool. This is a copy of the Problem Behavior Questionnaire, and they ask you to report on what percentage of time the person engages in the behavior. Again, a retrospective analysis, your memory, your anecdotal thoughts about what may be maintaining that behavior. Before I go on to Barton, let me just say that it's always been my thought and I'll talk about this in a bit, that one of the basic problems with all three of those instruments is how few number of questions they ask. I think that's the one problem. Um, if you remember your statistics from your undergraduate years, you will remember that the less number of questions you ask in a situation like this, one difference in an answer on one question can lead to a fairly large difference in the overall basic results. Where if instead of having 16 questions or 25 questions, if they had 100 questions, you might, one differential response on one question really wouldn't affect it nearly as greatly if they had 100 questions than if they have 16 questions. The other is, I didn't like the way any of them laid out their answers. I think that if they had said, if their answer options had been, does the person engage in the behavior less than once a month, between once a month and once a week, between once a week and once a day, between once a day and once an hour, between once an hour and once a minute, or more than once a minute, you might get more consistent results with it done that way. So I've always thought somewhere someone would come out with one more try, a fourth option where you had 100 questions or 200 questions, I don't know, whatever number would be good, that someone would answer and answer them in the way that I just laid out. I think you might actually get better reliability and you may get more consistent ratings of why the person's engaging in the behavior. But that's just always been a thought of mine. Barton and Arwood in 2003, they had 27 students with emotional maladaptive behaviors. This is the first time that anyone ever took these scales and applied them to non-self-injurious and people with non-developmentally disabled, but kids with emotional disabilities. They completed the MAS and the PBQ, initial administration 1 week and then 4 weeks later, and they reported fairly good results. They reported that the MAS items correlations were significant but moderate magnitude across administrations. And you can see that their data seem to suggest that these instruments could be used with children who suffer from some type of emotional disability. The conclusions, as far as I'm concerned, are their behavior situation rating scales. First, there's a serious lack of data on technical adequacy for emotional maladaptive students. There's a couple of studies, but almost everything has been done with children and adults with developmental disabilities. It's tempting to practitioners because of the brevity and the numerical score indicating a function of the behavior, but to actually develop a treatment intervention that may place the individual at some level of risk. Remember, we're going to use extinction. What do you have in extinction? You may have an extinction burst. We may use graduated guidance, a hand-over-hand procedure. If we're going to do that and the person continues to engage in the behavior, there's always a possibility that someone could get injured. So we need to be very careful whenever we're developing a treatment intervention that we're doing it on the best possible data available. And I just don't think that these particular scales provide that. So some final thoughts. Are functional assessments useful? Well, I've just gone through a whole big argument about why they're not, but actually I think they are. I think they're useful at a very early level, giving you some initial ideas, helping you define the target behavior, and doing sort of a first cut assessment about why the person's engaging in the behavior. It gives you some ideas that you can keep working on. One of the things that my staff and I always do is we never just use the MAS or never just use the PBQ. We often will administer all three and look at the difference in the results from them. And it's not the case that we don't often get completely different results where they disagree with each other completely. So in order to maximize their usefulness, use more than one. What can you do to make them better? come up with your own. Just because it's not published in a journal yet, come up with your own. Come up with 200 questions. Come up with a better way of rating it, so that the individual that's responding has a more sort of concrete basis, and not just 0 to 6, never to always. What's a 3 or what's a 4? I think you and I would have a hard time agreeing on whether something is a 3 or a 4 because it's really not clearly defined. So anyway, do I think these things are useful? Absolutely. Do I think you should base a treatment procedure on someone who's causing tissue damage, or someone that's hurting other people seriously, by just using one of these instruments? Absolutely not. Thank you very much.